welcome and miles to go. Thanks for joining us today. Today we're going to work with the 5 warning signs of addiction and alcoholism. What we're going to do is define 5 of the many different risk factors associated with the onset of addiction or alcoholism in a person's life. They're not exclusive or definitive, but they're really big predictors of outcomes in people that suffer from exposure to these risk factors. So the first thing we want to do when we talk about addiction and alcoholism is define those terms. Now, if I ask the students in the classroom when I'm working with them, do you know what I mean when I say the word addict and alcoholic? They'll often, of course, they say yes, because they don't live in caves. They read books, they watch movies, they have family members perhaps that have struggled with these maladies, and so essentially they do know what they're looking at or what they're talking about when they see it. But here's the question that I ask them: there's a difference between being aware of something and being able to define it. Could you go to somebody who did not know the meaning of the word addict and alcoholic and define it for that person in such a way as they would recognize it the next time they saw it? And of course, the students and you also realize that's a harder job. That's harder to do than simply being aware of addiction and alcoholism. So what we're going to do today is work with a definition from the National Institutes of Health. Now, over the years, the definition has changed. If you check with the website today, one of the words that I'm going to give you here is not on the definition today, but it's been there in the past, and I really like working with that definition. So the NIH defines addiction with a couple of really powerful words. The first one is compulsion. When an addict is using addictively, they're basically compelled to use. Picture it like having a big hand in the middle of your back, pushing you toward use. Now, you can fight this compulsion. You can win some of these battles, but over time, your addiction, your alcoholism will conspire to make you use. You're going to lose this war. And so the compulsion is ongoing, it is ubiquitous, it is omnipresent, and you're going to have this push to use. Think about the idea of winning a battle. Say, for instance, if you were in a classroom setting, and right now, none of us are in class because I'm taping this during the COVID-19 pandemic, and so essentially we're all sheltering at home. But if you were in class and you were addicted to marijuana, your compulsion would dictate that you should use in that moment. You would want to get high. But if you're sitting in school, one of the worst ideas you can come up with is to smoke weed or to vape a little THC. If you're in class, you're just not going to be getting high. The costs and consequences are too high when they're associated with that activity. So you're not going to get high when you're in school, despite the fact that you are compelled to. You're not going to succumb to that compulsion. That afternoon, though, you're at home. Your parents are at work. Your big brother's off to school, off playing soccer. Essentially, you're alone in the house. Then you're much more likely to succumb to the compulsion than you would be if you were simply sitting in class. And so you won the first battle, but the afternoon you lost the war. The second word in the definition, this is the one that you won't see there in the most recent definitions at the NIH, is obsession. And the way I define the obsession as far as this definition is concerned is essentially when you can't get your drug of choice, if you can't get the drug you're addicted to or alcohol, if you're an alcoholic, what happens to your addiction? Why doesn't it just go away in the absence of the substance that caused it? And the answer to me would be you're obsessed with getting it. Your brain does not turn off. It's basically thinking about getting the drug 24/7 until that need is fulfilled. You're going to be obsessed with getting the drug. So compulsion and obsession are big parts of the definition. The third part is the question, when an addict uses and it hurts them, do they stop? And we know they don't, because here's the thing about alcoholism, this ongoing use pattern, despite the fact that it hurts people. So if you're using it, it hurts you, normally you would stop, but addicts don't. And so here's the definition of addiction according to the NIH. Obsessive compulsive drug seeking and use, which doesn't stop when that use directly hurts the user. It's pretty simple, it's pretty short, pretty easy to work with. Obsessive compulsive seeking and use of drugs, which doesn't stop when the use directly hurts you. Now, most of the time, if I'm in the classroom, I ask students, do you understand that definition? Do you know what I mean? And of course they do. Yes is the answer that I get all the time. So essentially, I give them a test. I want them to see if they can actually use the definition functionally in a real life setting. So picture a patient in a hospital. The patient is suffering with pain that is so deep-seated, if you don't treat their pain, they will lose their mind. They're going to go crazy with agony. So the doctors choose to treat the patient's pain with the addictive drug morphine in large doses every 4 hours for a year. At the end of the year, is the patient addicted to morphine? And almost exclusively, the students say, yes. Because how could you possibly be exposed to an addictive drug like morphine over an extended period of time in heavy regular dosages and not become addicted to it? But here's the thing. Let's do the definition one more time, okay? Obsessive compulsive seeking and use, which doesn't stop when the use directly hurts you. Now, is the patient being given the drug by the doctor without effort or request? Are they obsessively or compulsively using the drug, or is it simply being provided for them? They're not acting obsessively or compulsively when they get the drug. Are they being helped by it or hurt by it in greater measure? And of course, the answer is, despite the fact that all drugs have side effects, in this case, they're being helped by it more than they're being hurt by it. Here's the problem. The patient does not meet any of the criteria for addiction. The patient isn't addicted. And that's really hard to fathom because how could you use that drug over that period of time in that way and not be addicted? Here's the difference, okay? Now, the body, when exposed to drugs like morphine or any other addictive drug, definitely changes. It's going to establish what's called a physical dependence. Think about it this way. People in their normal everyday lives are in what's called a homeostasis. They're balanced. When you're operating at optimal performance, your body decides, okay, this is my sweet spot. That's homeostasis. When you put a drug into the body, it changes that balance point and knocks it out of whack, and then your body gets really displeased with that. Bodies don't like being homeostatically imbalanced. And so what they're going to try and do is struggle back to balance. I want you to leave this session with these words in your head, okay? Every single time you expose a human body to a drug which has the power to cause addiction, that body will change to make the next dose of the drug less powerful. So when exposed to drugs that cause addiction, the body changes to make the next dose less powerful. Why would that be the case? Because again, the body hates that imbalance. So what it's going to do is amend itself, adjust itself, change its composition in such a way as the drug has less power. So here's what the body does. You give it that drug, it responds to it in such a way as it falls out of balance, then it amends itself to come back into balance over time, especially in the case of regular high dosages. When you give a patient a drug regularly over time, the body constantly struggles to find its way back to homeostasis. Eventually, what happens is this. The new normal, the new homeostasis includes the drug. So you've compensated for the presence of the drug so profoundly that your new normal has the drug in the definition of homeostasis. Now, what happens when you take the drug away? Well, of course, the body falls completely out of whack the other way. Now it's out of balance. Now it's got to work its way back to a new balance in really difficult ways. Here's what we just defined, okay? We defined tolerance, dependence, withdrawal. So we just basically described physical dependence, not addiction. Now, physical dependence is a component part of addiction's definition, but it's not definitive. So when you have a patient who is physically dependent on a drug, it's not expressing addictive behaviors. The patient is not behaving obsessively and compulsively. So how does dependence in a patient progress into addiction? Well, that's a more complicated thing, but picture this, okay? So the patient has now essentially, the pain is gone. They don't need the medication anymore. So how do you get the patient off the drug that you've been giving them for such an extended period of time? Well, you could do it two ways. You could simply take it away and throw them into an abject withdrawal, but that's really brutal. Addicts say they'd rather be dead than go through that kind of pain, that kind of agony. So how would a doctor that's compassionate and responsible get the patient off the drug over time? Well, they would decrease the dose incrementally over extended periods of time. Here's the thing, though. High-dose morphine patients can take 6 months to detox. It's a really, really long road to get a person off of that drug in a kind, relatively benign way. And they're still not going to be happy, by the way. They're still going to feel nauseated. They'll still have a little bit of loose bowels. They're going to feel irritable. They'll feel anxious. They'll feel emotional. They'll suffer from insomnia. And those are considered mild withdrawal symptoms compared to the abject hell of true opiate withdrawal. So they're going to try and they're going to detox you. They're going to get you off the dosage you had down to a zero dose over time. Here's the thing, though. Most healthcare plans do not provide the care that you need during that period of your life. A doctor is not going to sit there and hold your hand through your decreasing dosages. They're basically going to give you a bottle of pills and say, go home and take less of these over time, and that's going to be your decreasing dose. Here's the thing, though. The problem is when a person goes home, after having been exposed to an opiate dose at a high level for a real long time, they're going to struggle to get back into their normal life. The next day, the person has to go to work. They got to get their kids to daycare. They got to do that PowerPoint presentation so they keep their job. But the problem is they feel terrible. They feel really bad. And so what they're tempted to do is take more of the medication they're supposed to take on an incremental basis or on a lessened basis. And essentially what they're going to do is, I don't feel good when I take one, so I'm going to take two. Then they feel normal. And they get to go to work, and they get to drop their kid off at daycare, and they get to do their PowerPoint presentation, and everything's cool, except the next day, they're still going to feel terrible because they didn't reduce their dose. And now what they have to do is they reduce the dose that day. Now they struggle with the issues they struggled with yesterday. So imagine that day, again, I need to take more than I'm supposed to. Here's what happens. Over time, they run out too fast. And they go back to the doctor and they say, Doc, you know those pills you gave me, I'm out, I need more. And the doctor will look at their chart and say, oh, no, that's not really going to happen because you've been taking them irresponsibly. I can't give you more. I'm not going to be able to do that for you. And so the patient now has no drug to take, no relief to get from that stair step down dosages. And what they're going to do now is go into abject withdrawal. And so they're extraordinarily sick. It feels like somebody's trying to pop their joints apart with a screwdriver. They ache like they've got the flu times 1,000. They have vomiting. They've got diarrhea. They're incredibly incapacitated, and they literally would rather be dead than feel like they feel. And yet they still have a kid to get to daycare, and they still have a job to do, and they still have to live their life. So now what the temptation would be, you got to get opiates someplace. Now, maybe, you imagine they go to the street and they have to start scoring some pharmaceuticals on the street. Maybe they're bootleg, who knows? But they have to start buying opiates in the street, and they cost a lot more than they cost at the pharmacy. So now they've got money issues, they've got all kinds of things going on, and they can't get them when they need to get them. So now they got to start amending their behaviors so they can score, even though it's really inconvenient and really illegal. Now, how is the patient acting now? Are they obsessive and compulsive in their seeking and use? Are they being hurt by it more than they're being helped by it? The patient who started the drug legitimately has now broached into addiction. They've now transitioned into addiction, and that's the problem. If you look at the statistics today, essentially what you'll find is about 80% of the opiate addicts in America today got their first dose of an opiate drug in their lives from a doctor. They were legitimate patients who used the drug for a valid reason. Unfortunately, what happened is they didn't understand the power of that drug to compromise a person. It's really powerful stuff. So when we talk about the definition of addiction, that's the one that we're going to use. Obsessive compulsive drug seeking and use, which doesn't stop when the use directly hurts the user. The second thing we want to do is quantify addiction, okay? We want to basically look at the idea of how many people in each 10 anywhere in the world are ever going to be addicted to any drug in their entire lives. So when you look at this, how many people out of every 10 will be addicted to a drug? Now, here's the first challenge, okay? We have to take out 2 drugs before we can talk about this challenge. The idea that we have to take 2 drugs out because they mess the numbers up really badly. The first drug you have to take out is caffeine. Now, why would you have to take caffeine out? Well, because 9 out of every 10 American adults uses it regularly. And I read one time that 8 out of 10 American adults uses caffeine every single day. Now, it doesn't mean they're addicted necessarily, but a lot of American adults are addicted to caffeine. It doesn't ruin their lives. Like I always tell the students, your mom's not going to be in the street hijack a Mercedes to get her next venti latte. But it does mean that there's a number out there which we can't include because it would skew the number so artificially high that it would be meaningless to look at the number. The second drug that has to come out is nicotine. We have to take nicotine out because despite the fact that Americans today smoke at our lowest rates in history, we've never smoked less than we do today. We don't represent the rest of the world. And so essentially, when you go to certain places around the world, you're going to find smoking at such high rates that if you were to include it in this number, it would mess the number up dramatically. For instance, the last Winter Olympics were held in Pyeongchang, South Korea. On the day they lit the torch in Pyeongchang, South Korea, 56.4 adults over the age of 18 that were male were addicted to nicotine. So if you had Korean males over 18, the day the torch was lit in the Winter Olympics in Pyeongchang, the number over the 10 just with nicotine would be 5.6. Even more dramatic an example would be 4 years earlier than that in Sochi, Russia. When they lit the torch at the Sochi Olympics in the Winter Olympics, 70.1% of Russian males over the age of 18 were addicted to nicotine. And so the number over the 10 over here, if you went 4 years back to Sochi, would be a 7.1 with just nicotine. If you threw all the rest of the drugs in there, you would have an impossibly unworkable number. And so we can't include caffeine and we can't include nicotine. Now, what's included in the number that's left over? Okay, alcohol, marijuana, cocaine, methamphetamine, opiates, including opium, codeine, morphine, heroin, fentanyl, Dilaudid, Percocet, Percodan, Darvon, Darvocet, Vicodin, OxyContin, all of the other drugs, including the stimulants like Adderall and Ritalin. Despite the fact that they are usable medically, they are also abusable and addictive. So we have to worry about all of those other drugs. Ecstasy might fall in there. All kinds of other drugs, including everything except caffeine and nicotine. How many people in any case anywhere in the world out of each 10 would be addicted addicted to those drugs over time. When I leave it to the students, oftentimes they'll wander around. They usually start at about 6 and they'll go up or down for 3, 4, 5, 7, 8, 9. And what you have to realize, if the number were 9, think about that for just a second. Some students say 9. Okay, great. Well, let's work with that. Imagine there's 40 people in a room full of students. If 9 out of 10 of them will eventually be addicted to drugs and alcohol in their lifetime, that's a problem because that's 36 out of 40. And that's just not going to be the case. It's an unworkably large number. So what's the actuality? What's the real number? What's the chance that any one of 10, out of every 10 people, how many will be addicted? The actual answer is 1. 1 in 10 people, anywhere you go in the world, in large random groups, will be addicted to drugs and alcohol in their lifetime. So the lifetime normative risk for addiction is 10%. Now, one thing I want to be really clear when we point this out, okay? These numbers don't work in small groups. They don't work in anything but large random groups. You cannot apply this to individuals. It's large random groups. You'd have to fill Dodger Stadium with randomly selected people, and then of those people sitting in that stadium, 10% of them would be addicted to drugs and alcohol in their entire lives. The other 90% would not. So 10% addiction rate. Now, 10% is certainly better than 90%, but it's not a good number. You don't get relaxed because it's only 10% of the population. If you think about America today, say 340 million people in America today, that means 10% normative risk factor is 34 million potential addicts in that population. That's a lot of people. That's the majority of the state of California right now. And if you think about another way to look at this, okay? Take a snapshot of any society at any time ever. And when you look at how many people are addicted in that moment, normally you'll find anywhere around the world, they vary from 3 to 8% of the population is currently addicted to drugs and alcohol. Which was just US skew on that spectrum? Essentially, unfortunately, we're at the high end of that spectrum. And so in America, depending on which study you cite, worst case scenario, there might be 24 million Americans currently in need of drug and alcohol treatment in America. That's pretty bleak. 24 million people today need treatment for addiction to drugs and alcohol. Here's the second status thing you will hear all day. Of those 24 million in any given year, usually around 11% of them, about 2.6 million people will get treated. Unfortunately, that's not very many. So about 2.6 million of them get treatment. The other 89% of them will get nothing in any given year. And here's the saddest thing you will hear all day. If these 2.6 million people represent initial attempts to get clean, what you will find is over time, about the success rate is about 15%. So they're going to fail at rates between 85 and 90% failure rates for these people if it's the first attempt to get clean. That's pretty bleak. So essentially 34 million potential addicts, 24 million actual addicts, 2.6 million of them will get treated. About 15%, about a couple 100,000 of them are going to escape the nightmare of addiction and alcoholism. The rest of them are going to drive off a cliff for another spin, for another pass through the addiction nightmare. And so that's pretty bleak stuff. But let's go back to the idea that 1 in 10 people anywhere in the world will be addicted over the course of their lifetime to drugs or alcohol. That's the normative risk. Unless, of course, they suffer from what we started talking about, which are the risk factors. Now, we define these risk factors. Remember, they're not definitive, but they're very powerful predictors of outcomes over time. The first risk factor, interestingly, is not a risk factor for addiction. It's a risk factor for what has to happen before addiction can occur. And of course, that would be use the drug. The first risk factor is for use, not for addiction. The biggest factor here is environment. If you hang around with people who drink and smoke weed, over time, you will drink and smoke weed at a higher rate, whether you intended to originally or not. Environment predicts outcomes. If you spend time in the presence of a behavior as a human being, you will mimic that behavior over time at a higher rate than if you weren't exposed to the behavior in the first place. So if you hang around at parties, here's what the CDC says about parties. Teenagers, 70% plus of their use of drugs and alcohol happens at parties. More than 70% of teen drug and alcohol use occurs at parties. So what environment would you be most likely to use in? A party. The problem is this: I don't want you to not go to parties. I want you to have a good time as a high school or a middle school student. The problem is if you go to those parties and there's no adult supervision present there oftentimes will be drugs and alcohol present, and that environment predicts really bad outcomes for you. I don't mean to be a killjoy, but parties with drugs and alcohol at them ensure higher rates of use on your part, even if you didn't intend to in the first place. The second risk factor is a direct risk factor for addiction. Addiction runs in families. So if you have it in your family, you are now on notice. You have a higher risk profile than if you don't. One parent who is, was, or ever will be addicted to drugs and alcohol in their lifetime will mean your number is now a 4/10. So one parent makes your risk factor 4 in 10 rather than 1 in 10, which is the societal norm. Now, here's the important point, okay? It doesn't matter when the addiction occurs. It can be before you're born. It can be after you're born. It can be while you're born. You will suffer from addiction no matter what point in that spectrum you were born, because it's basically a genetic predisposition. The parent who suffers from addiction and alcoholism will pass on to their offspring predispositions for that addictive process as well. It doesn't mean you're born an addict, well, although that is possible in certain cases when parents who are addicted to opiates or other drugs give birth to a child, that child will be addicted as well. That's not what we're talking about here. This is a risk factor which basically says if the parents struggle with addiction or alcoholism, you will struggle with it at a higher rate because they gave you the DNA of struggle. They gave you the DNA of predisposition to addiction. If you have two parents, I've seen studies which indicate this: the presence of two parents who struggle with addiction or alcoholism in their lifetimes means your number is now a 6. That's profound. That's really powerful stuff. Here's the problem. A lot of my students, when I ask them, don't know their family histories vis-a-vis addiction and alcoholism. They just don't know their family histories. And I can understand that. That's not something you want to chat about with your 6th grader over dinner. But the thing is, if you're in 8th grade and you're going off to high school, especially in a different geographic location than you did middle school, you need to know your family history of addiction and alcoholism, because it's a risk factor that you can incorporate into your decision-making process. If you know you have a family history of addiction, you can say, that's a really terrible idea for me to start using because that predisposes me to higher rates of addiction, especially if you struggle with the third warning sign, which is this: early inception of use. If you start using early, you're going to struggle with higher rates of addiction and alcoholism in your lifetime, especially if you start before the age or at the age of 14. 14 and younger is profoundly powerful in its ability to increase outcomes in adult addiction and alcoholism rates, especially with the drug alcohol. Give me a bunch of 14-year-olds and compare them to a bunch of 17-year-olds and compare them to a bunch of 21-year-olds. All of them start regular drinking at these ages, okay? Now, what's regular drinking, first of all? Regular drinking is drinking to intoxication 6 days out of 30. So if you get drunk 6 days out of 30, you're a regular drinker. Give me a 14-year-old who does that, or give me 100 14-year-olds who do that, drink regularly at the age of 14, and if every 100 14-year-olds who behave that way as adults, I will give you back 47 alcoholics. That's astonishing. The risk factor for a 14-year-old group of people that drink regularly that they will become alcoholics is 1 in 2. Now, the problem is when you think about that, well, let's do this, okay? Let's continue on a little bit. What if 17-year-olds behave that way? Out of every 100 17-year-olds who does that, we will give you back 25 alcoholics. So drink regularly at the age of 17, you cut the risk by half. Give me 100 21-year-olds who drink that way, though, and I will give you back, as adults, 9 alcoholics. So we go from 47 to 9 just by waiting 7 years to start our regular drinking. Here's the problem with that statement. We could eliminate 70% of the risk here simply by waiting 7 years to start our drinking. But you would have to get 14-year-olds to cooperate with that. You'd have to have them incorporate this risk into their decision-making process in a meaningful way. And the problem with 14-year-olds is not that they lack intelligence. They don't. They're really capable people. The problem that they have is their brains don't really have the structures required to put themselves into a future which contains them as adults living the consequences of a choice made at 14. So a 14-year-old has grave difficulty projecting themselves into a future which meaningfully contains them. They don't misunderstand the risk, by the way. If you tell a bunch of 14-year-olds, this is a risk in your life, yeah, great, I understand that, but they won't personalize it. They don't incorporate the risk factor into their own personal life because most teenagers have this sense of invulnerability. They have a special factor or feature about them, which essentially says, I'm not going to struggle with that because of this. I'm too tall, I'm too pretty, I'm too intelligent, I'm too good at soccer, I'm too Jewish, I'm too Catholic. Whatever it is you think you're too much of that will protect you from this risk factor, understand this. Listen to the risk factor as it stands, okay? Use regularly at or before the age of 14. Become an alcoholic in adulthood at a rate of 47 out of 100, absent all other influences. It doesn't matter what else was going on, this is going to predict your outcomes despite all other factors or influences in your life. This is a profoundly powerful risk factor. Now, watch what happens if you combine two of them. If you have a family history of addiction to alcohol or drugs, and you start using or drinking at or before the age of 14, especially with the drug alcohol, your addiction rates to alcohol as an adult, if two of these risk factors combined together, hover between 80 and 90%. Remember what a joke it was when we were talking about 90% of the population becoming addicted in the 1 out of 10 model? Well, in this case, if you have risk factor 2 and risk factor 3, that's the truth. That's the way this plays out. They are incredibly powerful additively. So if you got a couple of them working against you, you got some serious risk factors at play here. The fourth risk factor is tolerance. And we already defined tolerance as essentially needing to use more of a drug over time to get the same reward you got from the first dose. So as you become tolerant to a drug, you got to up the amount you use to get the same reward you got previously on a smaller amount. So over time, that's called use-based tolerance. This is a different type of tolerance, though. This is genetic. So if you're born not feeling the effects of a drug, it would seem almost counterintuitive that you would become addicted to that drug. So for instance, if you drink and don't get drunk, do you rationally fear alcoholism? And the answer, of course, is no, you don't. You don't feel the drug. But picture the scenario wherein you experience that, okay? So you're drinking with a bunch of people around you. One person has they drink 3 beers and they're completely faced. They're swinging from the chandelier. You drink 3 beers and feel nothing. Do you stop drinking and say, oh, God, I guess I'll just go do some homework? Or do you look at the other person and go, wait a minute, why don't I feel that? I better keep drinking until I do. And students initially, they instantly realize, wait a minute, of course, I'd keep drinking because I'd be curious as to why it's not affecting me. If it takes the second person 6 beers to feel what the first person felt on 3, who's more likely to become the alcoholic over time? Well, the second person. High tolerances predict higher outcomes of addiction because you drink more frequently and you drink in much greater quantity. If you start at 14 or younger and find you are highly tolerant, I saw a study one time which predicted outcomes of addiction to alcohol at over 60% risk factor. So if you have 2 and 3, you're 80 to 90% more likely to be addicted. If you have tolerance, if you have 3 and 4, you're 60% more likely to be addicted. If you have 2, 3, and 4, you can see how things get really bleak here. If you're playing with a multiple risk factor profile, you got some serious problems going on. And the last one that we have to talk about is the fifth warning sign. Now, it's got a really weird name. It's called the wow factor. It's also called the oh my God moment. When you do a drug, you have the response, oh my God, that's the most powerful thing I ever felt in my life. You're not going to follow it with a sentence, I'll never do that again. That's madness. Of course you wouldn't. You just experienced something. Listen to the way addicts talk. Listen to their stories. Read their books. Watch their movies. Almost every single one of them will have the story of the day their life changed. That will be the day they found the drug of choice, the drug of addiction. And here's the thing, it's not always the first drug you do. Remember my usage history. If you haven't heard it before, I started smoking cigarettes when I was 8 years old. I started drinking when I was 12 years old. I started smoking weed when I was 14 years old. And all of those did things to me, but they didn't change the way I viewed the world. That was cocaine. When I did my first line of cocaine, I think I was like 18 or 19 years old. I did my first line of cocaine. Now, if you would ask me at that time, what's the world like for you? I would have said sad, lonely, afraid. I was never diagnosed as this, but I was probably suffering from depression when I was a teenager. It was awful. And so when I did the drug cocaine for the first time, here's what the drug cocaine does. It causes this massive outpouring of dopamine in the brain, and it keeps it there for much longer periods of time than normal. So what you experience is this incredible rush of euphoria, and you feel unbelievably joyous. Here's the way I describe my first line of cocaine. For the first time in my life, I could define the word joy for you. That's the way the drug affected me. Now, it doesn't affect everybody that way, but for me, it was profoundly life-altering. When I did cocaine, here's what my brain did in response to that drug. It said, you will now use this drug in as great a quantity as possible, as often as possible. And here's the most powerful part of the definition: no matter what. Doesn't matter what it costs you, you're doing this drug from now on. I gave cocaine, listen to the list of things I gave cocaine in my lifetime. I gave it my education. I gave it my first jobs. I gave it my house. I gave it my cars. I gave it my first marriage. I would have given it my life if I had the chance to, but luckily for me, I went into drug rehab before I died of cocaine addiction. That was so profoundly powerful. And listen to drug addicts when they talk about their stories, and you will always hear that factor, that element at play. I had a hole in me. It was empty. When I found the drug, it went away. The hole was filled up. My life became complete. I was, for the first time, a human on the right planet. And it's profoundly powerful stuff. Now, here's a problem with that risk factor. Both risk factors 4 and 5 require use. In order to know if you have them, you have to use. Now, tolerance, you might be able to work around that one. Try working around risk factor number 5, though. When you find you have it, you can't possibly walk it back. It's a really big deal. The problem with the 5th risk factor is this, though. It's mostly anecdotal. It's just stories being told by addicts. And one of the things I promised my students in 7th grade when I first meet them in the intro is this: I'm not going to tell you anything in my class unless it's backed up by a scientific study. I'm not going to tell you a story because I like the way it sounds. I'm not going to give you information as a means of manipulating your behaviors so you make me happy rather than you happy. I'm just not going to do it. It has to be scientifically sound and factual before I say it in my classroom. A bunch of stories from addicts is not sound science. It's anecdote, as I said before. The problem is it doesn't seem trustworthy. But here's the thing. There are scientific studies which back up this factor, okay? They're basically called ACE studies, adverse childhood experiences. So if you as a child suffer from a list of trauma, you're going to be traumatized, and you will have a 2 to 4 times higher likelihood of addiction or alcoholism in your adult life for each of these trauma that you experience. Here's some of the things that are on the list, okay? Extreme poverty when you're young is one of the traumas that we talk about that you would have an ACE outcome from. Extreme physical abuse when you're young. The loss of a parent to incarceration, mental illness, or death. Sexual abuse when you're young. All of these now, divorce actually plays in. It's called a minor stressor, but basically it's still really stressful. Divorce makes the list as a secondary element here. So all of these things, for each of them that happens to you, you are 2 to 4 times more likely to suffer adult addiction to alcohol or drugs. I read an article recently which said this: if you suffer from top 5 of the 10 listed traumas on the list, you have a 10 times increase of addiction in your lifetime than if you don't suffer any of these. So the ACE studies, the adverse childhood experience studies, predict the outcomes of the 5th warning sign, the oh my God moment. Because you're wounded emotionally, the drug tends to relieve that wound for a short period of time. But when the relief goes away, you're tempted to redose and re-up and go after it much more powerfully, much harder, with much more passion because of the fact that it made you feel better before. It doesn't fix anything. It's not a solution. In fact, it's an incredibly open-ended path to destruction, but it seems to make so much sense because it fixes the immediate trauma. And that's really important. So here's the thing. If you see all 5 of these risk factors in the mirror in the morning when you wake up, you would probably be well advised not to use. It just doesn't make any sense. You're so at risk with so many bad outcomes possible for you, you should find another way to get your jollies, okay? It's just not going to work out well for you. If you see all these risk factors in a friend, certainly you'd be tempted to warn your friend about their risk factors, but understand this: it usually doesn't play out as well as you think it might. You're certainly being a compassionate, caring friend and warning your friend about the risk factors that they experience, but they're probably not going to take them with grace and equanimity. They're going to be offended. They're going to be defensive. You can do it. You can talk to people that are struggling with drug and alcohol issues. In fact, we actually teach a class in our junior year in high school, and it's called How to Help a Friend. You can visit that if you want to later on, but basically understand you can do this, but you have to be trained and aware of the proper steps and the outcomes that can happen, which tend to indicate it's not working. It's a really hard thing to do. Make sure you're trained and well prepared before you go out and start fixing friends. Thank you for joining us today. That was the 5 warning signs of addiction. Visit our other YouTube videos for more information, and we'll see you again.